Back after the cookies and photography session. This panel is entitled Trust and Privacy, How Does GDPR Impact End Users? So this morning we were discussing privacy and freedom of expression and the delicate balance between registrant rights and end user rights. This is a completely different discussion, of course, with different people, well, a different person.
We're going to have the same discussion.
And I don't even know if you were here for the previous discussion. We may still have the same discussion. But in any case, first let me introduce my distinguished panelists and then let them say more about themselves, because if I read their bio, it's not as interesting as if they tell stories about their youth or something. On my direct right is Alan Greenberg. Alan has been involved in ICANN longer than I can remember, because he's been involved longer than I've been involved. Since I said I wouldn't read his bio, I'll just leave it to Alan to tell you anything else about himself other than that. And one of the reasons I knew I was gaining some traction at ICANN was when the things I said to Alan didn't immediately cause him to think that they made no sense. So I hope I've improved along the line. To my far right is Debra Brown of the Association for Progressive Communications. You may remember her from this morning. So with no further ado, I'll let Alan and Debra introduce themselves a little bit more completely.
Okay, do you want just intros to start with?
Just intros to start with.
Okay. I've been involved in computing, networking, communications for about 50 years. All sorts of different things, all with a level of empowerment of people. And I ended up being responsible for all of the computing, networking, and things like that at McGill University, just down the street from us. I'm one of the people who brought the internet into Canada I'm one of the people. I'm one of the people who brought the internet to Canada about 30 years ago, and I've been involved in ICANN since 2006, which I guess makes 13 years, and mostly with at-large, although I've done a number of other things, and that's about it from a technology point of view. The rest of my life, when I have other time, I'm a genealogist and reunite families and that kind of stuff. So it's sort of a detective work in a different area. And I look forward to this discussion.
Well, initially I thought you were going to say that you were in your spare time you're a genie, but you went on after that.
No, that's when I'm in ICANN.
Okay. Debra?
Thank you. As you might have heard me say earlier today, my name is Debra Brown. I work with the Association for Progressive Communications. We're an international civil society organization and network of members working to improve access to the internet to advance human rights, social justice, and sustainable development. We work in around 72 countries. Our members do mostly in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. I do our global policy work, so focusing on global spaces, including UN spaces. Let's see, since we did a little personal introductions as well, I first got interested in this area. My background is actually in human rights, and I was living in Syria for a bit, studying Arabic, and I had to learn how to circumvent censorship and really understand the impact of surveillance on societies. I was there around 6 months before the uprising broke out, and just getting a sense of the pervasive effect of knowing you're being watched at all times, and the way that affects trust, since trust is one of the topics of our conversation today, and then the kind of differential access you have to information based on your technological skills. So that's sort of my entry point into this discussion or this field, but that's not really what we're necessarily talking about today, but thought to make it a little bit more personal.
Thank you, Debra. So trust is a word that has been discussed in a lot of different ways around the internet and around ICANN. It can mean trust in ICANN itself. It can mean trust in the internet as a whole. It can mean trust in a website, trust in a domain name, or generally just trust in whatever your user experience may be. And there may be other things. We can hear about that. Privacy also has been around for a long time, and we even before this morning's discussion. And balance of trust and privacy, whether trust helps privacy, whether there's even a dichotomy there, is something we'll explore and maybe go well beyond that, or maybe never even touch on. But we do have trust, privacy, GDPR, and end users as kind of our four nouns, so to speak. And so we can touch on each of those. GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, for anybody who doesn't know, is the EU's data protection law, which has had quite an effect at ICANN because of its effect on the Whois database and its availability, and which has in turn caused a so-called expedited policy development process to take place to deal with how access to Whois and maintenance of Whois, for that matter, will be dealt with in a way that responds to GDPR and to other concerns, privacy more broadly, access more broadly, and the like. And of course, we are kind of here to talk about things from the point of view of the individual end user, those who are staring at screens, not necessarily those in wearing other hats, although it's clear that people in the internet world can wear many hats. You can be an internet end user and a registrant, clearly. Be odd to be a registrant and not be an internet end user. So there are tensions in roles as well, but in any case, I'm not the one you pay good money to come here to talk about this. So I'll start with Alan, more because since he can kind of allude to the EPDP and what's going on there, but the larger issues, Debra has not been dipped deeply into the ICANN sauce, therefore, Alan can also kind of set the stage for what kind of is being discussed here in a more general way. I don't think we care about some of the inner machinations of the EPDP, and you'd probably rather shoot yourself than talk about them. So,
no worry.
I will turn to you.
Thank you very much. In general, I think one has to presume privacy is good. Now, if you're running a surveillance state, you may not believe that your citizens' privacy is good, but in general, privacy is good, and legislation which says that people who have your information should guard it and treat it respectfully, I don't think we can argue with that. But when you start looking at some of the implications of that, it gets a lot more interesting. Trust is a word Greg mentioned that is one of our topics. I have a trust story that goes back to a medium that's dying sadly at this point, newspapers. If you ever read a local newspaper, you tend to believe what's in a newspaper until you read an article that has something to do that you personally know about. And then you find errors. You always find errors in an article that has something that you personally know about. But when you go on to every other article, you assume they're correct. You trust it. Although you know at one point they're not worthy of that level of trust. It's a level of comfort and easy. So trust is a complex thing. It's not something that we can get your hand around very easily. GDPR makes a number of assumptions. It says generally, if you're giving someone your data, you want that data to be accurate because you want to be contactable by them. It turns out in the context of domain names, a large number of the registrants of domain names don't want to be contactable. They don't want their information to be accurate. So how do you implement a privacy legislation which presumes something in a context where that premise may not be true? Many users of domain names are doing things for antisocial and illegal reasons. And so they register domain names for those reasons. They also steal domain names for those reasons. Okay. So you have interesting situations such as you as a private individual, a natural person, have your information confidential. I, as a nasty person, break into your website and start using it for nasty things. The cybersecurity people find out about that and they want to contact me the legitimate owner to tell me that someone's doing nasty things, but they can't anymore because my information is now private. So you see, some of these issues get rather complex. Bottom line is, I believe that we have to think of those 4.3 billion users and make sure that they can trust the internet to do what they want to do. Even though we know, you can't believe everything you read, and no one thinks you can believe everything you read, but you have to try to minimize the impact of the really nasty things that can go on for those users.
Can you just speak a little louder, Alan, because there's some cover noise.
I'm sorry, I seem to be fading, okay.
There's also people talking.
One of the things that has become obvious with things like GDPR, and it's not the only privacy legislation around, is it is expensive to implement. The estimates currently are GDPR has cost corporations around the world somewhere between 10 and $100 billion. We don't know what the number is. We're never going to know what the number is.
Somewhere between 10 and $100 billion.
Something between 10 and $100 billion to implement the privacy legislation. Now, why are we implementing it? Privacy legislation has been around for a decade.
Or more.
Penalties appeared, big penalties, serious penalties. So suddenly it becomes something you can't ignore, and the cost is high. But as a result of that, if you look into an ICANN context, when we started to look at how do we respond to GDPR, one of the key points that the contracted parties, the registrars and registries, who have money in this game, said we've already spent a huge amount of money implementing GDPR for other parts of our business. Let's keep the costs associated with what we're doing here as low as possible. As a result, our policies allow GDPR to be over-implemented. So instead of just protecting the privacy of natural persons, people, we protect the privacy of corporations. Instead of just protecting the privacy of places where legislation applies, we do it universally in terms of the geographic things. Now, that may not be bad, but there's implications of it. The second order, the unintended consequences are quite interesting. And they're not necessarily related to ICANN or the internet. One of the unintended consequences is if someone breaks into one of your accounts, they now have your credentials. They can now go to the database owner and demand all the other information about themselves. Because from the database owner's point of view, they are who they say they are, and they have a legal responsibility to respond and respond quickly. The right to be forgotten is an integral part of privacy legislation in many jurisdictions. One of the classic cases is a doctor convicted for malpractice has the right to say, I want that information hidden so no one else can find out about it. Privacy is good, but there are implications of it. And as we implement privacy in all sorts of different areas, we have to think not only about why it was done, with the good motives, but what the implications of it are, and what the results of doing privacy are that we really have to consider. We care about people's privacy, but we also care about finding out who the people who distribute malware and the botnets that take down the internet. How do you balance those?
Debra, it's all yours. You don't have to answer all balance.
No.
You can say what you
So we're having
what you think about it.
yeah.
But
No, I think I'll start off by some of the points you raised towards the end, which I don't think anyone would disagree with the fact that privacy is good, but that's not why we protect privacy. We protect privacy because it's a fundamental human right. So I think, there's things that are good and bad in the world, but we have to look at the rights framework and the laws upon which people have protections. And so, as we said earlier, privacy is a fundamental human right that was first put forward in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, then was codified into the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, I believe in 67 or 76, by the time it got ratified. And the dynamics around privacy have changed dramatically since then. There weren't emails back then. The idea of data being everywhere collected around about you and stored and processed and used for all sorts of different things simply didn't exist then. And that's why we need data protection laws, because that's how you give life and protection to privacy in the digital age. And I think for us, end users is one thing. Of course, people who are online and have access to the internet deserve privacy, but so does everyone else. And people who don't have access, the other half of the world, who might live in cities that have smart grids, or maybe they're not living in cities because they're in rural populations, but their personal data is still stored, and they need to have trust in the digital technologies that hold them. So I think even taking a step back and not looking only at users, but about people, because people have the right to privacy, and even if they're connected or not connected, whether they are registering domain names or not, they still have the right to privacy. So I think it's good to take a step back and see where this is coming from, that it's not just because it's a good thing, that it's good for business to be able to operate within the EU or with EU citizens in order to, and that's why you implement GDPR. It is why we have to now, but it's also a fundamental human right. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. In terms of some of the tensions that Alan brought up, absolutely. We don't think GDPR is a perfect instrument. It's also not the only one, as you said. I think there's 175 countries, somewhere around there, according to Graham Greenleaf, who does studies of this, countries where there's either legislation in place or legislation being developed. The issue of the right to be forgotten, I'm not familiar with the exact case you brought, but if there's information that is relevant to the public interest, that is an exception that you can't have that information delisted. And sorry, to take a step back, the right to be forgotten is a bit of a misnomer. It's not information that gets removed from the internet, it just gets delisted and delinked from a search about you. And in the case of a doctor who has malpractice claims, I'm pretty sure that would be seen as still relevant information, so I don't think that would be information that could be delinked from your name. We have some issues with it in the sense of for people who are running for public office, who are not yet public figures and might be able to still remove information from themselves or delink it from their names. We've seen examples of countries where people are starting to remove all the information and delinking it from their name and then running for public office. So there are definitely implications for freedom of expression, access to information, and democracy. We don't see GDPR or any specific framework as the best one. We think there's definitely room for improvement. And in terms of trust in the internet, encryption is incredibly important. That's a separate issue altogether. And so I think to look at any one document or any one law as a fix is probably short-sighted. It's more of a kind of environment that we need to look at as a whole and see what are the best practices and best ways and protections that we can have for the right to privacy. I think, so as it's been said, I haven't really worked in the ICANN environment, but I have seen, I work a lot at the United Nations, and there's been a lot of resolutions and advancement around the right to privacy in those spaces. Back in, I want to say 2014 was when Snowden's revelations came to light, and immediately following that, Germany and Brazil tabled a resolution on the right to privacy in the digital age. And since then, there's been 5 or 6 resolutions kind of ping-ponging between New York, where the General Assembly is, and Geneva, where the Human Rights Council is. And they've made incredible advances in terms of finding consensus language, even amongst the Five Eyes countries, the UK, United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia have even agreed to some of the text of these resolutions, which has kind of advanced international norms. And as civil society, drawing on the last panel, we use those new agreements or kind of updated agreements to hold governments to account, to advocate for better laws. And I think we heard that Brazil passed a data protection law in that time. So you see the interplay between some of the international norms and the leadership that countries or governments are putting there, and then implementing things at the national level. I'm not going to say Brazil is a perfect case, and certainly the US is not either, and there's very few governments we can actually point to in that regard. But I think there's definitely new thinking around what are the new threats to human rights in the digital environment. How do we use these old tools that were negotiated in a time that was very different from the one today and update those in order to to provide for better protections. So that doesn't really get to what was your question that you left
I
off?
don't have any question. I was really saying that this is a really complex issue. There probably are no simple answers.
Yeah.
And I think we have to, when we're looking for answers for specific situations, we really need to understand that it's not a black and white situation. And we're going to have to work hard to come up with reasonable answers. Because ultimately, I think the internet is a major force in the world. It's not likely to go away. And given the number of people in the world who are now using it and will be using it, we need to do whatever we can to make sure that people have an ability to understand to what extent they should trust it.
That seems like a fair idea, but still have many challenges. So I think to dig a little deeper, Alan, I don't know if you have any, I know that you're not a genie, but is there a way that you can see forward to a more general concept of how to find the balance between legitimate access to data in the ICANN context and the privacy of the registrant in this case?
You left out one of the equations. You left out that there are lots of people with data who want to keep it to themselves reasonably. There are a lot of people who want access to data. There's a relatively small number of people that are holding the data, but it is a significant number. GDPR envisions that there be a controller of data. Controller is a technical term in GDPR and other privacy legislation. It's the person who is responsible for making the rules and typically holds the data. ICANN is a rather unique beast